Hi, I'm Gary Ralph, and this is a lecture in the series for History 156, American Sexualities. And this is part two of a series that I am doing on the gay and lesbian experience in the United States in the 20th century. The first part, I was talking about middle-class men who engaged in the first part I was talking about working-class men who engaged in male homosexual behavior. And the idea that it was very gendered in the sense that in a working class relationship, you had one guy who was being the man, which was normal, and one guy who was being the woman, which made them less respectable among macho men who all were proud of their manhood, but also made it acceptable for macho men to have sex with them because they were inferior like women were in a basic way. In the middle class, this wasn't so much accepted. And in the middle class, many men who preferred having sex with other men thought about it in exactly that way. They thought that the guy they were having sex with was another guy. But in the end of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, there still was a feeling that the normal kind of relationship was a relationship between a man and a woman. And it wasn't necessarily the case that in a middle-class relationship you had one person being the man and one person being the woman, but you might have both of the men feeling that as what we would call gay men. Very often they used for themselves the word queer and didn't see anything particularly wrong with that word. In fact, as I was growing up, many politically oriented gay men would refer to themselves as queer as a political act. But these guys would think of themselves as men, but with a feminine component. In Germany, there was a very strong movement for homosexual rights before World War II. And one of the ideas that was being kicked around was the idea that there was a third sex, that there were men, there were women, and then there were men who had strong feminine components and women who had strong masculine components. And it wasn't necessarily that this made it all right for them to have sex, but it somehow made more sense for a lot of these people to think of themselves as being in a third category, neither male nor female. There were people who rejected the idea that you had to have a feminine component in order to be a man who was attracted to other men. And many of these people used the poetry of Whitman as a kind of ideological example of how men could love other men. As we discussed earlier in the semester, when you look at Whitman's poetry, the idea that Whitman was a man loving other men is, to say the least, ambiguous. I mean, there's certainly a passionate attraction that he feels for other men that he talks about, but whether this is a romantic emotion, it's very hard, especially in terms of the 19th century, to classify. Now, where were these middle-class men who were not going to the dance halls unless they enjoyed having sex with working-class men? And sometimes middle-class men would go to the dance halls to pick up very masculine guys who thought of themselves as being normal men. And as long as the middle-class men who were picking them up were willing to behave in the subservient female manner, they could have relationships with these working-class macho men, if that's what they wanted. But if you were in the middle class and you didn't want to be feminine, didn't want to put yourself in this distinctly inferior category as far as the men you were going into bed with were concerned, you had to survive in regular society and somehow be able to find other men like you. You did not have gay bars. You did not have places like the dance halls where you could go. So middle-class men before World War I and during World War I developed a kind of system where they were able to identify themselves to each other, special words that they would use, special clothes that they would wear. I mean, it might very well have been the case that if I went out wearing a pink shirt, other people who knew what it meant to be wearing a pink shirt would say, okay, he's gay like I am. Maybe I should go talk to him and see if I can make a date. So there were ways that these people found each other, but that it was very under the radar, and back in those days, before World War II, people were much more innocent about these things. It wasn't the case necessarily that if I went out wearing a pink shirt, everybody would say, oh, he's gay. They might say, well, that's a kind of flashy color for a guy to be wearing. But only gay people would have been likely to pick up on the idea that I was sort of advertising my sexual preferences by wearing a pink shirt. Later on, and we'll talk about how this changes during World War II, it becomes possible for people to be identified by straight people as homosexuals, as members of a special group. But before, in the 1910s and 20s and 30s, people did not really think in those terms so much. It was true, though, that middle-class men who were not interested in sleeping with other men began to get very defensive about the idea that they were not people who wanted to sleep with men. One of the things that happens, we've talked about some of the changes that take place in the working class community as a result of the Industrial Revolution. There's a second revolution that historians talk about that takes place in the 1880s and 1890s, which involves the idea that big business becomes very bureaucratic. They have lots of offices and filing cabinets full of papers, and there are some people who work for a living in these circumstances where they are basically office workers, what we would call white-collar workers. And many men at this time felt that that was not a very masculine way to work. I mean, in the 19th century, there had been strong differentiations between men who did masculine stuff and women who did feminine stuff. But in terms of being a filing clerk, a man could do that or a woman could do that. And actually, you had offices where men and women were working side by side doing this kind of work. So some men become very nervous and say, well, I can no longer prove my masculinity by the kind of work that I do. So instead, I'm going to prove my masculinity by showing that I really like women, and I really do not like the idea of having sexual relationships with men. And furthermore, I think that anybody who has a sexual relationship with a man is inferior to me. This was their way of asserting their manhood. And this is a slightly different take on the whole situation, because the thing that I was discussing with the working class was that the men who were fairies were abnormal and inferior, but the men who went to bed with the fairies, and the men who were doing all of the things that you identify with masculinity, were normal. They just happened to have a particular preference in terms of the kind of person they went to bed with. Middle-class men at the beginning of the 20th century are saying that both of the people who are fairies and the people who go to bed with fairies, are abnormal. And as medicine begins to confront the whole idea of what we would call homosexuality, in fact, the word homosexuality only begins to be used in the 1890s and the early 20th centuries, they think of these two people as different kinds of wrong. I mean, they think of the person as who exhibits feminine characteristics. They call that person an invert, and sometimes associate that with the idea of the third sex that I was telling about before. But they look at the straight identified man who behaves in a masculine fashion and who wants to go to bed with these feminized men as being a pervert, as being somebody who would be normal if he didn't have these desires to do these weird things that are certainly not anything that a healthy male should be able to do. So there was an idea that the invert, the feminized man, might have been born that way, might have been born as a member of this third sex, whereas the man who went to bed with the feminized person was somebody who, he could be normal if he wanted to, if he would just pull it together. And for him to be having sex with these feminine men was like taking drugs or, all these things that people do, and they're supposed to be morally reprehensible or something like that. But the medical attitude, and to a certain extent the attitude in middle-class society, was that the feminized person, maybe there was nothing you could do about them. Maybe that was just the way they were. And the people who were working for gay rights in Germany were saying we're using that as the argument. They were saying there's nothing we third sex people can do about being the way we are. We were born this way. And please give us rights. But the idea that the male-identified person had a choice as to whether to go to bed with a woman or to go to bed with a feminized man, not to mention two supposedly normal masculine men going to bed with each other, this was basically a nasty habit carried to the extreme. And this is where you begin to see this problem with gay men being thrown into mental hospitals, gay men being subjected to shock therapy, which is one of the things that people thought when shock therapy emerged from the psychiatric profession in the middle of the 20th century, people thought that would be an appropriate way of trying to discourage men from engaging in this weird predilection they had for going to bed with other men. So you in the middle class, much more than in the working class, you get a discrimination against gay people of any kind. In the working class, it's okay for you to have sex with a man if you are a real man and the person that you're having sex with is an effeminate guy who doesn't have the same social status as you do in working class circles. If the relationship between two men is anything else but that, then in the working class, there's a problem and you can be ostracized. There's an interesting example where, in George Chauncey's book that I was telling you about, there was a man in the Italian community who was, he was hanging out with the men, and then one of the men asked him to go home and have sex, which he did. And then he felt like he couldn't go back and face the other men, even though it was one of the straight identified men who had asked him to have sex, because the straight identified man had gone back to all the other pals and said, oh, I took that guy home the other day, which meant that, of course, the guy's status in the community went, but the guy who had taken him home continued to have a status as a masculine man because he was the one who had done it to the other guy. He had maintained the masculine role. And so that made him acceptable in the gay community. Next time I'm going to be talking about lesbians, I guarantee you. See you then. Bye-bye.